I discovered it as I went along. I really was in the dark, not to pun a phrase, but he, I guess, existed as this sort of companion to his invention. I thought his invention of the light bulb, not his development of someone else's. And that goes for a lot of what he achieved in his life. It was a furthering or a progression of other ideas as well as his own unique and original ideas that marked him out. I was really drawn to the flaw of someone who began life in a very humble way, traversed a great difficulty, but used it to his benefit, his bad hearing. And then the story itself seemed to me more about someone who really chose not to hear a repeated truth, something that he couldn't really afford to acknowledge because of how far down the road he was and how that corrupted him. And the more research I did, that Michael lent me, that books I read like Empires of Light and various biographies of Edison, the more I realized there's a very varied reception, understanding and appreciation of the man. So in a way that gave us a freedom to tell our story the way it is.
There was not a lot of information about George Westinghouse. How difficult was it for you to put together this character?
It wasn't super difficult because my goal wasn't to try and create an exact total replication of George Westinghouse. It's just not possible. So it was more, I just more considered his point of view and his way of being in the world, his way of dealing with people. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed inhabiting this ghost of what I suppose this person might have been kind of like, you know. But it's a ghost. There's nobody's going to come along and say, "Oh, you messed that up," because nobody knows.
I didn't know much at all going into it. You know, I knew the name and the rough outlines of a few things he created, but yeah, going into it and learning all his idiosyncratic nature and, you know, his obsessive compulsive moments in his life, and also his germophobia, all these little elements, his imagination and all these things that kind of built him up to be slightly odd perhaps, but also incredible in terms of what he could create. That was just amazing to read about, and then learn about the foresight that he had and how selfless he was in many ways in terms of, you know, the work really being for the good, ultimately.
I think it's deadly to judge your character if you're portraying someone. You have to inhabit it with a certain amount of understanding or empathy or sympathy, whatever you want to call it. What we see is a man who had achieved a great deal from humble beginnings, who feels assailed in the world. I don't think that ever left him. I don't know where it began, that need to succeed, to win, to have a control. It's an ugly truth, and yet it's formed out of something that's very human. I think there's some degree of salvation in the sense that he admits he was wrong, he knows he was wrong, and he doesn't view it as being robbed, but he did then go on to, as you say, overlord a lot of patent controls over certain inventions that he had a lot to do with, but he wanted to keep that fence very high and very strong and keep those people out of his inventive garden, so to speak.
Are you drawn more and more to real characters rather than fictional ones?
No. I didn't know much about Edison. It wasn't really that was the draw. The draw was the script and the human dilemma I saw in it, not the idea of playing a sort of totemic cultural figure. And that's kind of, if you do that, and in a way, it's terrifying. You know, like Michael says, in some cases these are ghosts. You're playing with the idea of something rather than being it, even though you are being it yourself, but you're not being the thing it was, if that makes any sense. You're approximating, you're interpreting, you're trying to channel something of it as a storyteller. That's what attracts you rather than the challenge. If you have the expectations that people who are real have a more detailed or very strong stance on a character, then you can really come unstuck, I think. Well, and that happens in fiction as well. I played some much loved fictional characters, whether in the comic world or Sherlock or whatever, and you're treading on hallowed ground for a lot of fans that were there way before you started meddling with that material. So you can't be inhibited with that. You respect it, but you have to bring yourself to the work rather than everybody else's preconceived idea of what it should be.
Something that inspired me was that Alfonso found a book about George Westinghouse, a very beautiful little leather-bound, very old book, and it's very hard to find a book about George Westinghouse. And it was almost like a tribute to George Westinghouse. It was written by somebody who had a great deal of respect for him and talked about what a great man he was and all of his accomplishments. And yeah, by the time I finished reading it, it really done a number on me.
I had a similar very thin volume, which was an extract of a diary late from Edison's life, and I think it's out of print, and Alfonso and the production found a copy. It just illuminated a very human core to this man. He talked very frankly about his dreams. He was very funny. He was very self-deprecating. He talked a lot about his diet and bowel movements or lack thereof. He talked about his love, his fantasy world. He talked about his great love of literature, what he was buying. He talked about how he got into a mess in New York because he asked the conductor on a tram which stop he should get off at, and he couldn't hear him. And it's little keys to that make you go, in our story, we're very much trying to look beyond the P.T. Barnum presentational Edison, although there are a couple of moments of that, and closer at the private man and what the machinations of that were, and the failures in that as well, with the neglect of his family that his obsession kind of brought about. But I was very warmed by that. I thought that Michael had done an incredible job of being true to that little nugget of light, to a true source of who he was like with his imagination. I'm sure you'd read that as well. The diary extracts, but so yeah, that was an inspiration.
For Tesla, through this story, he'd had the vision or idea in his brain when he was about 6 years old, I think, of harnessing the power of waterfalls and creating electricity through that. So that was, his main goal, particularly through this part of the story that we see him at. And then the interesting thing that Alfonso did for me was turn me on to listening to Glenn Gould's Bach variations, because you get little snippets of Tesla in this movie. But he has such highs and lows because, he sees so far into the future that a lot of people can't comprehend what he's trying to express. And obviously that makes you feel very misunderstood. And also he ends up penniless and then comes back, and he's so many ups and downs that listening to someone play those songs, those compositions at varying different times in their life and trying to tap into whatever that was going on with him was kind of useful in a way for Tesla.
Because we only really have the one scene together at the end. I was really looking forward to shooting that scene. The filming started primarily with Edison's stuff because I wasn't even available yet or something, and so they shot a lot of Benedict stuff first, and then I showed up. Yeah, and he was having a baby. It was crazy, heady days. So we kind of blocked it out, and then towards the end of shooting my stuff, Benedict came back, and we shot that scene in Brighton. The Brighton, what's it called? The Pavilion.
Yeah.
And the beautiful. I remember walking in a room and seeing that set and just feeling, this got to be one of the coolest sets I've ever been on in a movie. And I felt that way so many times when we were shooting in the house that was Westinghouse's home. It was just really exciting, inspiring, these locations, And it was weird to be working with Nick playing Tesla because we had done another film together where he killed me. So this was a lot friendlier, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that was because originally in the script that was kind of the one scene for Tesla was with George Westinghouse in the hotel room, and I read that and loved the scene, but also knew it was Michael playing the role, and I was just like, I loved working with him previously, so I was like, brilliant. I'll sign up to do that and hang with him again.
I was very excited when I heard about these two being cast. I was over the moon. This one here is one of our era's great heavyweights. He's the real deal, and he does what cinema can do best. He's just got it all, and theatre as well. But I've only seen him on screen, sadly. This young pup. We've met a couple of times, haven't we? Oh yeah, but we'd not. What does that mean? Tongues will mag. But I was very excited to work with Nick as well, and we had fun, and I got the giggles very quickly because he's very funny, and I loved my scene with Michael. It really upped my game, and I'd had a bit of a break, and it's such an important moment to have those two men have a almost consolatory meeting, isn't it? In a way, it ends with the big question: why not just share the rewards? Why not just enjoy it and move on together? I like to think in that moment anyway, the thought process from my character, you'll have to sort of see what you think of it, but I like to think that he's like, I accept I maybe got that wrong, but he moves on to new terrain, and a new tyranny of that terrain. But in that brief moment, I think he has a point, maybe, but I don't know. He has just sort of talked about how a fence is a steal because only one man makes it and the other man benefits, but he has the stronger point in that argument, which is that you don't need the fence, you can just share. Anyway, I had a great time working with these two.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey